From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Egypt's economy and the role of entrepreneurship. Like countries across the Middle East and North Africa, Egypt has been hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic, and the economic fallout is likely to be severe. To help us make sense of where things stand and the role entrepreneurship and startups can play in Egypt's post-corona recovery, we're joined today by two great guests, Mirette Mabrouk and Dr. Sherif Kamel. Mirette is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Egypt program. Sherif is the dean of the School of Business at the American University in Cairo and the president of the board of governors of the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt. Mirette, Sherif, thank you both for joining us today and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Mirette, let's start with the general macroeconomic picture in Egypt. How much of an impact has the pandemic had on the economy, and which sectors have been the hardest hit?
Okay, so the quickest answer is to say it's several sectors have been hit quite hard, but we haven't yet seen how bad it's going to get. It's important to note that Egypt is not unusual in this regard. Every other country is going to be going through things like this, but we are speaking about Egypt here. What we're probably looking at going down the road is either a U-shaped or a V-shaped downturn. And what that really just means is the time that it's going to take to be able to pull out of it is going to differ depending on a few things, which we'll get into. We're still in the first maybe few months, and the first few months, the only things that have been really noticeable have been, for example, tourism. Tourism is a major source of revenue for Egypt, 12.5 billion last year. It had been doing quite well. It had been on the upswing, but of course, what with the pandemic, it's taken a hard hit. And tourism is losing about $1 billion a month while this goes on. That's a huge amount of money. Again, I know that you're going to be asking about this a little bit later on, but the sectors that are likely to be hardest hit as well are likely to be remittances, which is another area of revenue for Egypt. It's a big area, and possibly Suez Canal revenues as well. Obviously, internally, you've got things like domestic consumption are going to be dipping. Now, you want to bear in mind that consumption in Egypt had been shrinking anyway, although Egypt's economy had been doing fairly well. I mean, it had been growing at about 5.4%, which is significantly over world average. But much of that had been from investment, particularly public investment. Unemployment had gone down. Things were looking rosier on some cases, but consumption had been shrinking. It's likely to shrink even more now. So we are looking at a bit of a crunch going forward.
Sherif, given everything that's going on, surely this is a time when entrepreneurship is more important than ever. What does the current entrepreneurial ecosystem in Egypt look like?
That's a good question. If we look at the past 10 years, entrepreneurship really grew right, left, and center. Egypt has a large population growing at almost 2.2 million people every year. So if you look at the dynamics of the population, we're talking about 60% that are under the age of 30. The bulk of those are in their teens. I always look at the population and call it a baby population rather than a youth population. And I think that's a massive opportunity. That young population is more than ever tech savvy. You look at the numbers, the people that are connected on the internet, the people that carry cell phones, and the percentage of that cell phones that are actually smartphones. That created sort of an ecosystem by itself, composed of people who historically always opted for a civil service job opportunity. But since the late 2007, 2008, there has been sort of a change in that space. More people want to start their own business. And that is not new to Egypt, but I'm now talking about the tech-enabled and tech-based startups. If you look at the dynamics of the economy in general, high 80% and plus are actually based on SMEs and startups as a component of the GDP. But in recent years, and I'll use the term here, the gradual and smooth digital transformation and way of doing things has been growing dramatically. If we had that discussion 10, 12 years ago, I would have told you that we had maybe one incubator, a group of, 100 people who talk that language. Today, we're probably talking of hundreds, and we're talking of hundreds of startups that are coming up through the system every year. That actually is primarily based on the opportunities enabled by information and communication technology, and obviously the fourth industrial revolution, AI, and so on and so forth. That in itself, I look at it as a change in mindset. Obviously, there is no one size that fits all, but the entrepreneurial culture, which is for me, is even more important than actually promoting entrepreneurship by itself. Because entrepreneurial culture, you try to do things differently. You try to change, regardless where you are. Naturally, many of those are coming up with solutions across different sectors, let it be transport, logistics, financial payments, healthcare, education, and so on. So the space of entrepreneurial ecosystem in Egypt has been changing, has been growing. Egypt actually scored last year when it comes to the MENA region as the number one in terms of that were conducted when you add up the investments that were put in startups. One of the companies that actually went through sort of the idea phase and then the acceleration phase and then went into the market is a solution that is very much needed in Egypt given the traffic. The company is called Swivel, SWVL. And to simplify things, it's the Uber of buses. So you also see the nature of the entrepreneurial ecosystem most recently focusing more on issues that solve or can handle solutions for the community, for the sectors I just shared and others. So I think it's dynamic. I think it's growing. I think moving forward, given the events of the past few weeks and the pandemic, we will see more solution coming up and more answers to some of the questions made by the society at large through digitally based solutions and applications and services.
Sherif, what does it take to be a successful entrepreneur in Egypt, and how important is experience versus education?
You always have two schools. People tell you that entrepreneurs are born gifted. Others, they need to feel that no, you can learn it. I am one of the believers that you can learn anything. You find in Egypt micro, small, medium size enterprises and startups that are extremely successful. Their founders cannot even read or write. So it's a mindset. It's the ability to be focused, to be passionate about something, to look at an issue, to try to come up with a solution. And then the most important thing is to scale it up, to make it sustainable, to scale it up, and then to have an impact. So education is important. Mentorship is important. Financial resources are important. But from start to finish, the idea, the vision that one should have, and then take it up through the different phases is extremely important. Of course, the nature of the culture differs from one country to the other. And I'll tell you a simple example. Some cultures are very much recipient to failure. Others are not, including the culture here in Egypt. But that too, I feel it is changing. If you go back 10 years, people would shy away from trying something new. They like to go mainstream. They look at what other people are trying and then they can follow suit. That too is changing. And we can see that even in the age bracket of those who go into the sort of the notion of starting up their own companies and so on and so forth. It is, going down in terms of age bracket year after year. We see younger people who want to go out and try their ventures, let me put it that way. Of course, that space is changing, and that space is get affected by the nature of the sector, the conditions of the economy, the opportunities that are enabled. But today, for startups to succeed in such environment, they have to be resilient. They have to be really creative. They have to really think of services and products that are very much catering for the needs of the community, for the simple reason that we actually live in a global environment. The competition is extremely fierce. I quote Tom Friedman 15 years ago when he said that the world is flat. I think the world over the past couple of months turned out to be flat, fragile, disrupted, dysfunctional in many ways, which creates so many different opportunities. But at the same time, competition is all over the place. There is a level playing field in the digital platforms. So when you come up with a solution, especially that I mentioned that most of the upcoming solutions are digitally based, then you're competing with the best from all around the world. And you really need to be upping the game to be able to succeed in such environment.
Mirette, how big of a problem is unemployment in Egypt right now, and how can startups help to address that?
I think that's an excellent question. I actually happen to think that unemployment is one of two factors, the other one being scarce resources that are going to impact Egypt more than almost anything else over the coming years. Egypt had actually been doing quite well on unemployment. Unemployment had dropped to about 8.5, and they were actually doing quite well. This the pandemic, of course, is going to cause problems. However, it must be said that the government did, especially on tourism, the government did try and step in. And for example, the Ministry of Tourism issued edicts that companies could not fire their employees and could not refuse to pay them. And the government is providing stopgaps for this. The Ministry of Tourism recently closed down a major hotel in Sharm el-Sheikh that had let its employees go, just to make a point. However, we've got almost 800,000 people entering the workforce every year. That figure fluctuates from anywhere between 5.8 to almost 800,000 a year. A good section of those are younger, and an even bigger section of those, comparatively speaking, are women. Women, despite the fact that they have consistently done better on education than males, are still bearing the brunt of unemployment, and it's largely to do with societal issues and the higher cost of childcare and all the rest of it. But unemployment is it's often referred to as a ticking time bomb, which I always find a really negative way to look at it. As Sherif pointed out, it can be seen as a huge boost, but the fact is that it does need to be addressed. And this pandemic, again, along with every other country in the world, is going to possibly place constraints on that. So the government is going to have to be careful to try and, not employ people. That time is past, but the government is going to have to try and make sure that the investment climate and that the startup climate is healthy enough, pliable enough, welcoming enough to be able to welcome people into the workforce if they want to enter it.
Sherif, how important is a startup culture for a country like Egypt?
It's a young population, as I said. Everybody holds a cell phone is in his hands. Even social media is growing like crazy in this country. I think last year Egypt recorded the sixth or the seventh country in the world in terms of relative increase in the use of social media. And I think even with the events during this pandemic, with the notion of social distancing, although I keep repeating, I don't like the term social distancing because I think we're becoming more social than ever. I think it should be more physical distancing. I think these numbers are also going to go up. So with that youthful population, an entrepreneurial culture is invaluable. But to have that, it takes a whole ecosystem to work together, starting off with the educational system. Educational system that encourages and that promotes and that has as an integral part of it experiential learning, critical thinking, complex problem solving, promoting creativity, discovery, innovation, and of course entrepreneurship. I repeat myself, I think that anything can be learned, but it's not like entrepreneurship 101. It's how you think, how you want to introduce change, how you can, through the educational ecosystem, which is very much integral to the entrepreneurial ecosystem, graduate young, promising agents of change, the movers and shakers of tomorrow, who can actually make a difference. And I can draw here very simple parallels of, for example, the proliferation of 10,000 plus startups in 2019 in Silicon Valley, with a total of investment of 130 billion US dollars, which is more or less 50% of Egypt's GDP. But the essence of that ecosystem is cooperation and diversity. And I mean by that, the people that are there, the universities that are there, the banks that are there, the research centers that are there, the corporations, the innovation centers, and so on and so forth. That creates a culture. It's an environment that has to be well integrated, well coordinated. And in fact, we have that in Egypt, but that environment is primarily diversified and cooperating with each other amongst the, believe it or not, the accelerators and the startups and the investors. It takes more than that. It takes, I for one, I've been sort of pushing for the idea to have incubators in every single university in Egypt. I also, a culture cannot be based on a city. And Cairo is not Egypt. Cairo is 1 million square kilometers. All the attention is in Egypt. Yes, we see some startups coming out of Alexandria, out of a couple more cities, but Upper Egypt is. I've been there. I've taken part in mentorship sessions and workshops and so on. 600 kilometers to the south of Cairo. There's a lot happening, and you can really find youth with fantastic ideas. They just need a window. They just need a chance. And of course, it's much easier for them if they have incubator and accelerators, either standalone or university based in their own neighborhood. It's not that easy to travel 600 kilometers to do a sales pitch or to share a meeting or what have you. So, is it important an entrepreneurial culture for Egypt? Absolutely yes. Do we have many of its ingredients? Yes. And I think there is a lot that happened over the past 10 years, but given that the size of the population is 100 million and counting, I still strongly believe that this is a fantastic opportunity that is we're still scratching the surface.
You mentioned incubators before, and I wanted to specifically ask about Venture Lab, AUC's startup accelerator. How has it evolved and grown over the past 7 years, and what have been the kind of lessons learned from that process?
That's the question that is very close to my heart. Back in 2010, at AUC School of Business, we came up with a program we called the EIP, and that program stood for Entrepreneurship Innovation Program. We wanted to, going back to your previous question, help create the culture in Egypt, not for the students of the school or even AUC students, but Egyptians at large. So we put together a program, sort of a platform that offers training courses, workshops, mentorship sessions, one-to-one meetings for the newly evolving groups of young entrepreneurs who want to have their startups based on one technology or the other. We've had 3 years of, I would say, fantastic impact in collaboration with many entities in Egypt. We always positioned ourselves as the educational partner of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Even putting my other hat of the American Chamber of Commerce, I, together with my colleagues at the Chamber, we helped established the EIC, which stood for the Entrepreneurship Innovation Committee, which is again today is a pillar in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So come 2013, at the time we had organized multiple competitions, training sessions. You're talking at least 5,000 people went through our training programs. We offer all that for Egyptians. We offered it for free. People used to really come during the weekend to attend those classes if they were students or if they're working. And then in 2013, we decided it's time for establishing a university-based accelerator. Back in the spring of 2013, we launched we call it the Venture Lab. And although it's hosted at the School of Business, by design, we called it the AUC Venture Lab. And we wanted to send the message that entrepreneurs can come from everywhere, from social sciences, from engineering, from business, from economics, from mass comm. It has to be diversified. It has to be multidisciplinary. Fast forward 8 years, we've gone through 14 acceleration cycles with close to 200 startups that were accelerated. We usually start the interview process with about 500 applicants. We end up with around 20% of those, like 100. We train the 100, but 1/4 of those, 25, go through the acceleration. So that tells you if we've accelerated close to 200, how many people we trained and how many people actually applied for the acceleration program. We've had over 2,200 mentorship and coaching hours. That's besides the training. In terms of generated revenues by the startups to date, and these are numbers, I will not be comparing them to the likes of Silicon Valley and so on. These are numbers should be looked at and considered in the context of Egypt. The total generated revenues by the startup to date is $28 million, and the investments that were put in those companies to date are $95 million. The number of jobs that were created, both directly and indirectly, are north of 8,000. So this in 8 years, given the fact that we're more or less limited in the number of startups that we accelerate, has been fantastic. The most important thing for me actually is we offer that for obviously our students, our alumni, but I'm extremely pleased to tell you that 90% of the startups that were accelerated have nothing to do with AUC. They're just Egyptians from the 27 different governorates. They come from all over the place. And if they have their business plan, their sales pitch, they all in place, and they go through the screening process, they get accelerated, they're out there and they're making the market an incredible service. And based on that experience, is my dream is to have a venture lab or even a better model than the venture lab across Egypt's different universities throughout the different governorates.
Mirette, looking ahead to the second half of the year and into next year, what's the outlook for Egypt's economy more broadly?
Okay, so there are several predictions, but the most likely one is sort of the middle one, which assumes that containment to the virus is going to be fairly slow, and the virus won't be contained properly until the third quarter of this year. And what's likely to happen is that you're going to get economic disruptions through the second and third quarter, almost all the way through the year, and the economy is only going to start to pick up towards the end of 2022. And that's because recovery is likely to be significantly slower because you've got prolonged supply chain disruptions, you've got employee layoffs, you've got production being suspended because of quarantine, because of export-import restrictions. Again, the same things that most people are likely to be seeing. And that the economy will start to pick up towards the end of the year or through the beginning of next year. And this is likely to be the most likely scenario. They're predicting possibly, growth at about 2.3%. Now, it had been at 5.4%, but Egypt is the only country in the region that's projected to have a positive growth rather than a negative one. So we're thinking about, again, as I said, about 2.3%, maybe picking up to just over 3% by the beginning of next year. That's if things go well. The government has tried to put things in place for this. I mean, it's as I've mentioned before, I think one of the biggest problems is people in the informal economy, which are almost 63% of our labor force. And in mid-March, the Ministry of Manpower had announced a one-time payment of about £500 to, originally it was about 400,000 people that were registered as informal workers with the ministry. That figure has now gone up to about 1.5 million because people are registering. You want to bear in mind that registration happens online, and a great many of these informal workers may be illiterate, let alone tech savvy. But still, it is moving forward. Stamp duties on shares had been reduced. Twice as much for nationals as for foreign investors. To boost investment, foreigners will be exempt from capital gains taxes. Subsidies are back in effect on gas and electricity, which has been vital. There were recent amendments to the Constitution, which will allow the president to, among other things, halt rent payments and electricity and utility payments. So, they are trying to cushion that effect. And if Egypt is lucky, it will get through this possibly with less damage than other countries.
Sherif, we're running short on time, but before we conclude, I wanted to ask you what the landscape for startups in Egypt looks like in the post-pandemic period. What do you see as the sort of main challenges and opportunities?
It all depends. It depends how long that pandemic lasts, as it's going to be multi-waves. That would be definitely an important factor. Number two, the size of the business. We're going into a new phase that is not clear. We understand that probably the digital platforms are going to play a major role, but it depends what stage is the startup at. If it's early and things are not really crystallized and things are not really clear, I think the best thing is to wait and see. If it's the business is already there and it has a number of employees and so on, I think depending on the sector, there needs to be a rethinking of the model. What is the best model moving forward? And people should be very pragmatic because they need to be looking at the health and safety of their employees and at the same time, how they can keep sustaining the business. If it's in a more advanced stage, then definitely there needs to be adjustments, adaptation. We're talking about disruption here, and entrepreneurial mindset is all about disruption. You're bringing in a new service to a new platform to make a difference in the community, and here you go, we're getting disrupted from a totally different space. So how can we deal with that? Does it create opportunities for Egypt? Absolutely, yes. Does it also represent some challenges? For sure. The challenges will be how to deal with the numbers, how to deal with the impact. But the opportunities, I think they all relate to the services that could be offered to the community. And I'll just maybe wrap up with one very important service that could be crucial. You look at the Egyptian demographics when it comes to banking. We're talking maybe 11, maybe 12% of Egyptians bank their money. The unbanked tech segment is huge. The proliferation of fintech applications and the importance of bringing those people from the informal economy to the formal economy could be huge for the economy. And financial solutions that are simple to use, that are in many ways maybe outside the banking sector, but also offered through different applications, present an opportunity. And already, if you look at the startup space in Egypt, you'll find a big chunk of those startups are actually have been focusing over the past year or so on fintech application. So it's important for the economy at large to bring in the vast majority of the informal sector into the formal economy. And that in itself could be a fantastic opportunity. Maybe another opportunity could be something that Egypt invested time and effort over the past few years, which is the tourism sector. There has been a framework called E-Trip, Egypt Tourism Reform Program, which primarily opts to having at least one member of each family engage in offering a service to the tourism sector. Obviously, tourism is one of the most important sectors in Egypt. Definitely, like many other places in the world, it has been hit with the pandemic. But looking at post-pandemic, I think there will be so many solutions coming up through the platform of startups that offer services about tourism in Egypt. And we are already seeing over the past few weeks some of the tours of the temples and the activities that are offered online that probably in the future will be against money. And that again creates opportunity for employment, but also for the economy.
Egypt has traditionally had fairly weak social mobility. And one of the things that does is push people into self-employment. To date, it's been the informal economy, which has boosted the numbers for the informal economy. But a more recent trend is that it is pushing them into startups, which is having a very different effect altogether and should wind up being a net positive effect. This is why startups are so important to Egypt. It's not just that people are finding work; it's that people are being pushed out of the informal economy.
We'll have to leave things there for today. But Mirette, Sherif, thank you both for joining the program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you as well to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.